It's a special pleasure to welcome Ambassador Maksoud back to the Council. He was here, of course, about 3.5 years ago, and we enjoyed his presence then enormously. He's here tonight to talk on the general topic of Arab aspirations and policies. He's a distinguished lawyer, journalist, and diplomat. He received his bachelor's degree from the American University in Beirut. He received his Doctor's of Jurisprudence degree from George Washington University and his PhD from Oxford University. He served as representative of the Arab League to India and Southeast Asia from 1961 to 1966. As a journalist, he was editor of Al-Haran, first of all, in Cairo, of course, and then secondly of Al-Nahar in Beirut, serving in those positions from 1967 until he assumed his present position in 1979. He's the author of several books. They've dealt with the themes of non-alignment, the Arab left, Afro-Asianism, and the Arab image. And he served in his present position, which is permanent observer of the League of Arab States to the United Nations, and as representative of the Arab League in the United States since 1979. It's our enormous privilege and honor to have with us a distinguished spokesman of the Arab world to share his views with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Clovis Maksoud.
Mr. Chairman and friends, I'm delighted to be here this evening, although I am a little bit weary about the title, especially as it comes at a moment when the United States policies in the Middle East do not show the level of coherence that we would like it to show. As you know, in the last few days, several revelations about an alleged arms deal with Iran has been announced. Whatever might have been the motives for this arms deal, we would like to register certain reservations. It is not for us to comment on the decision-making processes in the United States government, but it is inasmuch as we are on the receiving end of some of these policies that we would like to record tonight our observations and comments, hoping that you would understand our position, be sensitized to our rights and aspirations, and in the final analysis, the communication that develops between us leads to further understanding and development of our relations. Let me say at the outset that the latest developments about the revelation of Mr. McFarlane's visit to Tehran is something that we have absolutely no objection to. Even if we did, we cannot seriously expect any result. However, it is important for us to distinguish between the need for the United States to restore channels of communication with a great country and a great people, the Iranians. And we think that this is, although it appears as if it's a sudden discovery, as the statements in recent days have shown about the geopolitical importance of Iran and the need to establish relations. However, the circumstances and the timing with which these channels of communication have been opened are done, we are afraid, at the expense of certain basic assurances that the United States has given the League of Arab States and the Arab countries, namely its constant neutrality in the Iraqi-Iranian conflict. This is a conflict between two countries whose spiritual bonds and cultural and historical association goes deep into history. And therefore we have made all our attempts to bring a quick termination of this hemorrhage on the blood of two peoples, bound, as I said, by a great deal of spiritual ties. And let it be stated also that although all the Arab countries have diplomatic relations with Iran, a testimony to our perception that the unfortunate conflict between Iran and Iraq is an interruption in the solidarity that exists, a cruel interruption in many instances, a hemorrhage on the developmental potential of two countries of oil-producing nations hoping to come into the world open to the scientific, industrial, and technological revolution. Yet, at this particular moment when there has been a response, whatever might have been the causes on the part of Iraq, to comply with the various interventions of the Islamic Conference, of the non-aligned movement, as well as of the United Nations efforts. We have been waiting for an equally positive response on the part of the Iranian government. Efforts in this respect have been undertaken on all levels, and we in the Arab world, despite the fact that Iraq is part and parcel of the Arab nation, a founding member of the Arab League, yet we consider that there is an overriding necessity to bring to a close this unfortunate hemorrhage that has bleeded two countries and two societies and two peoples. It is from this background that we would like to make a fundamental distinction between the desirability of establishing channels of communications and even diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran. Yet, if the cost of this is to be at the expense of fueling a war by the various arms transfers which have been done surreptitiously, then we consider that this is a fundamental departure of the neutrality that the United States has repeatedly assured us, the neutrality in the conflict between Iraq and Iran. We have always considered this neutrality to be a very positive and contributive factor to the ability of the international community to restrict the area of conflict, the zone of operations, and we have considered the neutrality of the United States to be a disincentive for both countries to continue in the war-making capacities. And that is why we have always appreciated the United States' neutrality in this conflict, and this neutrality has been affirmed repeatedly officially to us, and more emphatically when the meeting of 7 foreign ministers and the Secretary General of the Arab League with Secretary Schultz on October 5th, 1985. This neutrality also on the part of the United States was one point of convergence between the two superpowers, namely the Soviet Union and the United States. And this convergence made that this unfortunate conflict in the Gulf region not an arena to be exploited to further polarize the two superpowers, but at a moment when the two superpowers were meeting more or less on a regular state and at different levels, we considered that the neutrality of both countries on this particular issue would facilitate the convergence of interest in the interest of peace on various other issues. Hence, the departure from this neutrality constitutes a very important deviation from what we have been expecting on this matter. Now, last Friday, I have visited the Secretary General of the United Nations because I thought that the ferment, the intellectual and political ferment that is taking place in Iran, might be an opportune moment for the Secretary General of the United Nations to activate his initiative and the mandate that was given to him by the United Nations Security Council to pursue the peace efforts, and that the United Nations should become more and more visible, and because the United Nations can utilize the neutrality of the two superpowers to expedite the process of peacemaking in that region. There has been also other positive developments, namely in the OPEC meeting, which is being held now in Ecuador and 3 weeks ago in Geneva. There was a propensity towards unifying the oil policy, the oil policies, the pricing oil policies of all the oil-producing countries. Perhaps for the first time, there has been a genuine attempt at uniformity in the oil pricing, which could have had and could still have a political spillover on diffusing the tension that exists in the war between Iraq and Iran. I am mentioning this because I want to affirm that we welcome any development of understanding and relations between the United States and Iran, but I would like to affirm simultaneously that if the price of such restoration of relations, desirable as they may be, is the transfer of arms that would reinforce the war-making capacity and therefore obstruct the peace efforts that are being undertaken by the various intermediaries on the world scene, then we think that this is a very costly price at our expense. Now let me further mention that we appreciate and we are very sensitive to the agony of the various families of the American, British and French hostages that have been taken in Lebanon, and we think that there must be more reinforced efforts to secure their peaceful release. We, on our part, have tried as much as we can to do whatever is possible to expedite the release, because the unfortunate tragedy that Lebanon experiences has let loose many forces that at times seems to be unmanageable and uncontrollable. And therefore, we appreciate and we know, especially that the Lebanese from all factions realize what it must mean to be kidnapped, because hundreds and hundreds of Lebanese themselves have been kidnapped. We appreciate the violence that can be made to the spirit of people. We understand the agonies of the families and their eagerness to have them as instantly released. We have an insight into the reunion of the families of the kidnapped victims. And we think that it is a humanitarian undertaking and a duty on all parts never to tolerate the taking of hostages and to undertake any effort, any task, however difficult, to secure their instant release. Having said this, you would appreciate further that if, and I make a big if, release of hostages is coupled with the notion that certain arms transactions should be undertaken, if it is linked directly or indirectly or simultaneously, then I must submit to you that Arab lives are equally important to American hostage lives, and that the arms are bound to lead to further bleeding both of Iranian and Iraqi people, and the efforts to bring about a termination of this conflict would be seriously derailed. Furthermore, and perhaps the most objectionable part of this new revelations that have taken place is the fact that the Israeli factor comes in as a sort of a broker in an arms deal and in surreptitious diplomacy. Too much in this world community where mankind is trying to disarm, where even the two superpowers are undertaking in Geneva and other places serious efforts to bring about complete or gradual disarmament. Israel seems to be interested in fueling more the conflicts so that they do not become amenable to resolution. And if, and I emphasize again the term if, Israel interprets its strategic relationships with the United States to have this kind of underworld diplomatic and covert activities, then it puts into question a great deal of our efforts at improving American-Arab relations. Hence tonight, my friends, the ability of an Arab spokesman to convey to you a more structured speech is made complicated by the unraveling of these events of recent days. And it is crucial for us to understand that it seems that Israel is being uncovered, that it seeks to perpetuate the conflict between Iran and Iraq because it perceives of it as a form of keeping the Arab world off balance and therefore making an asymmetry in the balance of power, and hence whatever negotiations might ensue on the central issues of Palestinian rights, Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories would be postponed until Israel can establish more settlements in the occupied territories, annex more territories, continue its hegemony in South Lebanon, and therefore make the peace option almost an impossibility. It is from this optic that we view the latest surreptitious underworld type of diplomacy that Israel and certain elements in the United States administration have taken to constitute a corroding factor in the need to make rationalism in the Middle East pervasive, to render fundamental rights of peoples and nations asserted and guaranteed. And therefore, it is very surprising that when Israel poses as if it is in the forefront of expertise on combating terrorism, that it should be suddenly permissive of such transactions. Yet, we are keen to ensure that this unfortunate development that has taken place does not derail us again from central issues. We are understanding of the plight of the hostage families. We are understanding of the need to establish lines of communication between the United States and Iran. We are understanding of the need to open up societies on each other. But we do not acquiesce readily to the fact that it is at the expense of the possibility of continued conflict, of preempting the various peace efforts, and at providing Israel an understanding of the strategic relations that it has with the United States to be a license for it to entrench underworld diplomatic undertakings. But this is only what has taken place in recent days. But yet what has been taking place in recent years is, in the final analysis, much more important and much more determining of the future of that region. Therefore, I want to, inasmuch as the title has been Arab Aspirations, to speak briefly about what constitutes Arab aspirations. We are a nation which is rich because of the oil that we have, but we are a rich nation of poor people. And hence, when we increase the oil prices in the Arab oil-producing countries, it is in order to cope with the index of inflation, with the market system, and with the need to address and ameliorate our various centers of poverty. The Arab nation is an economic nation. There are rich oases and lots of poor people. We want our wealth to address our poverty. We want our wealth to be utilized in the minimum of time to maximize our efforts to diversify our capital formation and our productive capacities. We realize that oil is a depletable source of wealth, perhaps 10, 15, 20 years. Alternative sources of energy in the industrial world would make the industrial world less dependent on oil supplies. And therefore, in the process, while the industrial world is becoming energy independent, we have to make our nation not totally dependent on one source of wealth and capital formation. Therefore, we want to develop the institutional infrastructure of all the Arab countries. We want to enable our economy to be galvanized by the diversification of petrochemical industries, other industries which can enable us to sustain our economic growth in a world that is subjected to a great deal of transformation. Hence, we want to join the 20th century during the 20th century. And in this objective, we feel that we want to be able to cope and absorb the new changes that are unraveling on the world scene, in order that we can cope with the modern imperatives and the scientific requirements. in this spirit we have to realize that we are in a state of being challenged by the more advanced industrial societies. We want to face the challenge neither in competition nor in confrontation. We want to face the challenge by a method of communication. And in this respect, we don't want to be co-opted by the industrial world to become imitating it, nor do we want to reject it by conceiving of the West as if it's an alien entity to our growth. It is in this search for the synthesis that we are facing in the Arab world and in the third world in general a great deal of social dislocation, intellectual search, spiritual groping. It is in this respect that we have to redefine our terms of reference. How do we meet this challenge without confrontation, without being alienated? We have to meet it with a great deal of soul-searching within our societies. We have to redefine our terms of references by insisting that modernism does not mean westernization by necessity. Modernism is not a traumatic break with our past and our traditional values. But our traditional values is not and should not be construed as an attempt to close our minds and our spirit. We have to open up, indulge in discovery. We have to realize that being imbibed by the modern requirements does not mean a negation of our spiritual and traditional continuity. It is in this reconciliation between the fact that our past cannot be arrested by intellectual intransigence, religious fanaticism, theocratic egocentricity, ethnic fanaticism, but that our society, our Arabism, can be enriched inasmuch as the universe is a unity of diversity. But if diversity is an excuse to alienate, to assert what distinguishes us from the other, instead of what unites us with the other, then we would have abandoned the world for self-righteousness, which is a basic fallacy. It is in this spirit that our aspirations have to be redefined and communicated. Because people today feel that Arab nationalism is something of the past, that many of our inter-Arab conflicts, disputes, are a permanent feature and an inevitable manifestation of our failure. But let me, in this respect, redefine some of the terms that have been current in the media. One is that we do not have something that is called Islamic fundamentalism. If Islamic fundamentalism means authentication of our identity, then all the Arabs are Muslim fundamentalists. But if Islamic fundamentalism means a collapse into obscurantism, to arrest the flow of creativity and pluralism, then that is a Muslim fundamentalism that is alien to Arab tradition and Arab historical and spiritual development. The words must be chosen clearly and related to the particularity of our experience. Then we are termed moderate and radicals. Well, let me also put this in its proper context as we live in a changing world. All the Arabs are moderates if their rights are forthcoming. And all the Arabs are radicals if their rights is an exercise in futility. By continued presence of Israeli army in the south of Lebanon, perpetuating the tragedy of Lebanon. If all these challenges to the basic elemental authority of our legitimacy, if the United Nations keeps being marginalized, attacked by the Heritage Foundation and their likes, as if the United Nations is the enemy of the West, as if the United Nations, which in past history gave the birth certificate to Israel in the partition plan, and when the United Nations became more universally representative and inclusive of the third world countries that have fought colonialism and gained their independence, then the United Nations should be abused, should be reduced into its effectiveness because it has recognized for the Palestinians their right of self-determination. Such is the logic that has been exercising its negative impact on opinion making and unfortunately at times on policy making. The aspirations in this respect is also the fact that our image, our approach, our struggle on all levels has been categorized in many instances loosely as terrorism. Well, let me also tonight share with you how we feel and how we think. What is taking place in the south of Lebanon? What is taking place in the West Bank and Gaza? What is taking place in Golan Heights is resistance to occupation. That is a legitimate pursuit of aspirations and rights. What takes place in terms of hijacking planes, killing innocent people abroad, that is terrorism. But to lump terrorism and resistance together, as some have done here, in order to distort the legitimacy of the struggle of the Palestinians and of the Lebanese to restore their sovereignty and independence, and to deny them the right of self-determination, that is a form of political, diplomatic, and intellectual terrorism that is equal to the terrorism that is conducted outside the occupied territories. Furthermore, it is important to realize that there is a qualitative distinction between terrorism and resistance. Resistance is predicated on hope in the inevitability of freedom and liberation, while terrorism is the explosion of hopelessness. And therefore, perhaps one of the great enemies of terrorism is resistance. And in the attempt to confuse the issue, the blending together of resistance and terrorism has become a normal practice of disinformation. And talking about disinformation, We have seen the revelations in recent weeks about planting of stories in order to disinform, to confuse, to darken. Information is an instrument of enlightenment. Disinformation is an instrument of darkening the vision. And therefore, we have seen how in recent months, how the programs of disinformation, the pretexts that have been submitted, have all brought about a confusion of attitude. One doesn't believe what's going on. I don't want to spell out the disinformation on Libya, the current disinformation that is taking place on Syria. But what I want to state emphatically is that we are not insulated from mistakes, but we must be understood. And because hopelessness is a prescription for recklessness, it is crucial that understanding by the United States of Arab aspirations does not allow hopelessness to become all-pervasive. It is in this spirit that we have undertaken a program of continued information as a form of enlightenment, inasmuch as we seek to convey our aspirations and our achievements. We must also share with you our mistakes and our problems. This is the criteria of a consequential dialogue, not the platitudes of diplomatic relations, not the joint communiques after a nice dinner, but the continuous process of co-discovering each other, realizing that however different we might be, there is equally a process of how much united we are. And it is in this pursuit that we must understand the term negotiations. And here I come to that problem in the Middle East whereby we are expected to negotiate. We are for negotiations. We think that that is the channel by which we can achieve rights and aspirations and allow the peace option to be realized. But negotiations is not a substitute for an outcome of negotiations. Negotiations in itself is not an end. It is a means, it's a vehicle. And that is why when we are called to come around the table to negotiate, we say we have to define the parameters of the outcome, because at the end of the tunnel there must be some light. Nobody will negotiate whether the Palestinians have a right to self-determination. That must be assumed. You negotiate the outcome, how to structure it. You don't negotiate whether Lebanon has a right to retrieve its territory in the south. You negotiate the modality by which the international borders of all concerned can be secure and respected. You don't negotiate whether the Golan Heights belongs to Syria or not. You negotiate how the Golan Heights returns to Syria, but does not constitute any kind of a geopolitical detonator of more violence. You don't negotiate whether Jerusalem belongs to all the religious faiths equally, with complete access to all spiritually, politically, and institutionally. That has to be structured whereby Jerusalem becomes the spiritual anchor of all religious faiths, and the political capital of all the major owners of the territory of Palestine and those who share its destiny. It is in this respect that the Arab League in its summit conference in 1982 has spelled the parameters of a credible and feasible solution, and that was called the Fez resolutions, whereby we have stated categorically that we accept all the resolutions of the United Nations. And this means that while the United States projects that Security Council Resolution 242 is sacrosanct, we say that Security Council Resolution 242 has defined the territorial parameters of both a Jewish state and of an Arab-Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. They were considered occupied territories, which means that Israel must withdraw from them. We have not accepted 242 in its entirety because we felt that to treat the inhabitants of the Palestinian land exclusively in terms of refugees means that you are denying them the basic national rights of self-determination. Hence, we have stated that the parameters of 242 as the territorial patrimony of the two entities should be complemented by the right of self-determination. This we consider to be the manner and the means by which we can salvage the peace option. In this respect, we have supported the call for a United Nations International Conference on the Middle East to discuss simultaneously all the outstanding issues that have arisen from the Israeli-Arab conflict. We consider this to be the hallmark of the diplomatic option. And that is why we have called upon the United Nations to structure in a most clear-cut manner an international conference where all the parties concerned can deal with all the issues in order to achieve a comprehensive, just, and therefore durable peace. If not, I fear that those who are hopeful of the military option will find military confrontation. But those who are hopeful for justice to all will insist on the peace option that a Middle East International Conference can provide. In this respect, we feel that at this moment, when a new Prime Minister in Israel, Shamir, claims that the West Bank and Gaza are Eretz Israel, when he claims that he has the right of sovereignty and therefore establish more and more settlements in order to mutilate the national and historical character of the occupied territories, I think we are in trouble. It is important, therefore, for the United States, in view of its permissive policies towards Israel, to exercise a restraining influence on it in order to make it abide by the requirements of the peace option that a United Nations International Conference can provide. Otherwise, we will have further polarization, further violence, and an abdication from hope. It is the responsibility at this historical moment that the United States, a big power, a superpower, realize that it is not sufficient to be a big power. It is important and perhaps much more vital to be a great power. And the difference between bigness and greatness is the quotient of wisdom and objectivity that the United States can, and I hope shall, exhibit in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Arab Aspirations and Policies was the title of the address. That was not only treated comprehensively, but we also had a commentary upon the most immediate of policy complications, and as well as underlying considerations of permanent policy issues and a view of the Arab world. We thank you for more than we had anticipated. The floor is now open to questions. Yes, sir.
Mr. Maksoud, your opening sentence, your opening word almost, was the announcement. Would you kindly explain upon what basis you received that announcement? From whom? In the beginning of your talk.
The question, I believe, is what is the source of your information concerning allegations of the American role in Iran and the details of it?
First of all, the announcement, I never mentioned the term announcement. What I did say is that the United States has repeatedly reassured the Arab states and the Arab League, and more emphatically in the official meeting between the Committee of Seven of the Arab League of 7 foreign ministers and the Secretary General, about United States neutrality on the Iraq-Iranian conflict. And I said that we have always appreciated this neutrality. The fact that there has been a departure of this neutrality by the alleged transactions of arms deals to Iran at this particular moment constitutes to us a deviation from the neutrality that has been announced and repeatedly reassured to the Arabs.
Excuse me, that part I believe you'll find if you review your speech was in your aspirations. I'm speaking of the very first word, the announcement upon which you predicate up until you come to your aspirations.
I think the point that Mr. Rich is trying to raise is that it can be argued that the facts concerning America's recent involvement or alleged involvement with Iran are subject to some dispute and discussion. And I think he's asking for what is your authoritative source with respect to the facts that you've put forward tonight.
Well, I mean, for the last 5 days, all the United States media and newspapers, besides the international media, have reported these allegations which have not been denied, and therefore I must assume that these facts are at least verifiable, if not absolutely true. They are verifiable facts. They have been reported in the New York Times. I don't know about the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post and the Washington Times. I mean, every newspaper, every television that I have seen have reported these, and I must presume that not all the media in the United States would put its credibility at stake if these were untrue and not factual. I have a little bit, quite a bit of...
I think we'll have to, unfortunately, let that suffice for this particular
Well, the President
question.
of the United States referred to it on a question within the last 3 hours. He says, I don't discuss a no-hitter until it's over.
That is, well, therefore he
I
did...
would say that it's disinformation, or at best, just reading one newspaper after another whose credibility is what, 40%?
Maybe.
Well, Professor Friedman, please.
Ambassador Maksoud, you have spoken eloquently about alleged Israeli underground diplomacy in supplying arms to Iran and thereby keeping the Iran-Iraq war going. But I think you also should take a look at the weapons that are flowing from Arab Syria and Arab Libya to Iran, which is keeping the war going to a far greater degree than the weapons flowing from Israel. You have mentioned that the lives of Arabs are very important, and I quite agree with you. But isn't it a bit ironic that weapons from Arab Libya and Arab Syria going to Iran are also killing Arabs?
Professor Friedman asked that you comment on the irony of Syria and Libya supplying arms, allegedly supplying arms to Iran.
Well, first of all, Syria and Libya, during the recent meeting on October 18th of the Arab League in its special session, have all ratified the declaration which objected to any kind of occupation of any Arab territory, including part of the Iraqi territories. So the presumption is that these countries, if the allegations are true, have reassessed their position and have now joined the entire Arab world in seeking to diffuse this conflict as soon as possible. There has been, of course, certain access in the past, and it is unfortunate that arms sales have been undertaken. We are at this moment discussing not the transactions of arms as much as the circumstances of allowing arms to go as a precondition of restoring a certain degree of relationships. And in that respect, it falls as a devious or duplicitous manner of using arms as a weapon of underground diplomacy. I think that Libya and Syria, if they did it openly, and it was part of their... Yes. But they did it openly as if they did it because you seem to know about it. But this is an arms deal which is surreptitious and which is related to a condition precedent of a resumption of relations. The inter-party conflict between Syria and Iraq is well known. The ideological conflict between Libya and Iraq has been well known. And therefore, this has not been done secretively. The Arab League has been undertaking efforts to bring about the consensus on the Iraqi-Iranian conflict, and we have succeeded. At least it has been enshrined in the last declaration in the Arab League meeting where all have attended on this issue.
Yes, sir.
The Arab policy of establishing an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank and the internationalization of Jerusalem prevailed during the years when all this territory was under the occupation and control of Jordan, or did this come about since 1967?
Well, first of all, the right of the Palestinians to self-determination has been a constant, and we have, as I said, wanted to complement the Security Council Resolution 242 by providing and enabling the Palestinians to exercise their right of self-determination. Prior to 1967, the Palestinians in the West Bank were under Jordan control and government control. They were part of the Jordanian Hashemite kingdom. By the same token, the people, the Palestinians of Gaza, were administered by Egyptian control. They were part of the Arab patrimony. Whether they liked it or not, they were part of their Arab national patrimony, whether it's Jordan or Egypt. In this respect, at this moment, in the aftermath of 1967, when these territories were occupied by an alien country, by an adversary, namely Israel, and put under occupation, then the whole Arab League including Egypt and Jordan, recognized for the Palestinians two things: the right of self-determination, and that the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, is their rightful, legitimate representative. And therefore, in order for the Palestinians to regain their identity, the PLO was recognized in 1974 as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and on the other hand, the right of the self-determination. Now, whether they want to join Jordan, or join Syria, or in federation, or confederation, or an independent state, it is a right for the Palestinians to exercise. They have, for too long, been denied this right. This is they, as well as every people in the world, have exercised their right. The Palestinians and the people in South Africa are the only two entities that are still disfranchised from the exercise of this legitimate right.
I don't think you answered my question, sir.
Why?
I don't believe you answered my question.
Sorry.
The question was, did that policy prevail prior to 1967?
Yes.
And why was not an independent
Well,
Palestinian state?
because the urge for an independent Palestinian state at that particular time was not as acute in as much as the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Palestinians in Gaza were administered by an Arab entity, and they are Arabs, and they want to be governed by Arabs, or they want to govern on their own. At this moment, they are being administered, coerced, and suppressed by an occupying Israeli army, and that is why they want to remove this occupation and exercise their right of self-determination. So that is the difference. At that time, they were within the framework of an Arab homeland, whether it's Jordan or Egypt. At this time, they are not in an Arab homeland. They are threatened by continued Israeli plans of annexation, settlements, and occupation. So that is the difference. Thank you very much.
Let me apologize to many of you for ending our meeting much later than we usually do. Let me also apologize to many of you who had questions and were not able to ask them.